The year is 1954. The Cold War is escalating. Paranoia permeates the air, and space remains an unreachable dream. On the morning of May 14th, readers of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch unfolded their newspapers to a headline that read, "Like science fiction, 2 artificial satellites were orbiting the Earth." The San Francisco Examiner quickly picked up the story. This was 3 years before the launch of the Soviet Sputnik 1. The central mystery was born that same day. If neither the USSR nor the US officially possessed the technology to place objects into orbit, let alone a complex polar one, then whose satellites were they? The news immediately sparked 2 theories. Either it was a top-secret Soviet project ahead of its time, or it was something extraterrestrial. This gave rise to the main question that will drive our entire investigation. How could humanity detect an artificial object in orbit before it had learned how to launch one? This was just the first of many paradoxes we will unravel. The legend of the Black Knight rests on 2 paradoxical pillars. How could the most famous photo of the Black Knight, taken by a NASA shuttle in 1998, become the primary evidence for conspiracists when NASA itself almost immediately and publicly identified the object as a common thermal blanket lost by astronauts during a spacewalk? A full investigation of this image awaits you in the 6th section. And the second paradox: how could a Scottish researcher decipher random radio signals as a star map from a civilization that sent a probe 13,000 years ago, only to later disavow his own methodology as flawed and unscientific? A 13,000-year-old probe would be nearly 3 times older than the Egyptian pyramids, placing its creation in an era when humans were still hunting mammoths. These 2 questions are the key to understanding the entire story. They show how clear refutations do not destroy the myth, but instead strengthen it. By the end of this video, you won't just know the truth about the Black Knight. You will have a universal key to understanding how the most enduring legends are born from scientific anomalies, media hoaxes, and human belief. We will deconstruct the 3 key mechanisms of myth-making. You will learn to see the seams in such stories, how quotes are taken out of context, how scientific anomalies are given fantastical interpretations, and how random events are woven into a single conspiracy. You came with the question of whether the Black Knight exists, and you will leave with an understanding of how and why it was created. To unravel this story, we will follow 3 key points that, like bricks, built the structure of this myth. Our investigation will proceed along 3 timelines. In 3 minutes, we will travel to 1899, to Nikola Tesla's laboratory, and listen to the mysterious signals he believed to be artificial. This is the foundation of the legend. In 9 minutes, we will jump to 1973 and see how a Scottish researcher transformed chaotic radio echoes into a star map of a civilization from Epsilon Boötis. And in 18 minutes, we will be aboard the Space Shuttle Endeavour in 1998 to conduct a full investigation of the most famous photo of the Black Knight. Our journey begins. First stop, Colorado Springs, 1899. One of the greatest minds in history, Nikola Tesla, sits alone in his laboratory. His giant transmitter picks up rhythmic signals. 1, 2, 3. He is convinced this is an artificial code from the depths of space. The first contact in history, or a colossal mistake by a genius? In his diaries, he methodically rules out terrestrial sources, thunderstorms, interference, signals from competitors. His logic is ironclad. He stands on the verge of the greatest discovery, certain he is hearing intelligent beings. But he was not alone. In the 1920s, radio amateurs worldwide began to widely record the same phenomenon, radio echoes with an abnormally long delay. The anomaly transformed from Tesla's personal story into a global scientific phenomenon. Today, science suggests that Tesla, unknowingly, may have been the first to detect a signal from a pulsar, a neutron star discovered only in 1967. The echoes are explained by complex reflections of waves in the ionosphere. Imagine a river current flowing into a deep whirlpool. Some of the water swirls around and is released later. But if the sounds can be explained, what about the objects seen by eye and on radar? Why does a radio signal sent from Earth sometimes return after tens of seconds? This violates basic physics. For such a delay, the reflecting object would need to be millions of kilometers away, but the echo was too clear. What could hold our signal for so long? The first hypothesis from scientists was simple, a reflection from the moon. But the calculations didn't add up. The maximum delay for a signal from the moon is only 2.7 seconds. This couldn't explain most cases of long-delayed echoes, creating a scientific dead end. And then, An elegant theory emerged that explained everything: an alien probe in orbit. The Black Knight itself simply records our signals and plays them back with any desired delay. A simple and comprehensive solution. But reality struck back. Not a single documented case of such an echo contained meaningful information. It was merely a distorted reverberation of the original signal, not a response from someone. The real cause lay in the behavior of plasma within Earth's magnetosphere. But by the 1950s, the anomalies were no longer just sounds. They began to be seen. Why was Tesla himself absolutely certain the signals came from Mars, not from a satellite orbiting Earth? This fact completely contradicts the Black Knight legend that uses his name. The end of the 19th century was the era of Martian fever. In his 1895 book, Mars, astronomer Percival Lowell convinced the world of the existence of canals built by a dying civilization. Tesla's hypothesis was not madness, but a logical conclusion for his time. The irony is that in chasing Martians, Tesla missed a real discovery. He could have gone down in history as the discoverer of pulsars, but he mistook a natural phenomenon for an artificial signal and dismissed it. Here lies the primary mechanism of myth-making. The Black Knight legend ignored Tesla's actual hypothesis about Mars because it wasn't mysterious enough. Instead, the myth simply appropriated his authority, attaching it to a more exciting story about an ancient probe. The idea of a probe appeared much later, when the press exploded with news of phantoms in orbit. So the anomalous radio signals, the foundation of the entire story, have rational explanations, from pulsars to complex echoes in the ionosphere. But they served their main purpose. They raised a question. They created a psychological readiness to believe that someone was watching us. In the atmosphere of fear and paranoia of the Cold War, this belief could no longer remain abstract. It needed a physical manifestation. And in the midst of the Cold War, this belief found its first physical confirmation, on the screens of military radars. It was these headlines from 1954 that formed the second brick in the wall of the myth. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch wrote about 2 satellites in orbit. Where did this information come from if no one had such technology? At first glance, it seemed like a leak of top-secret military data. The source of the news was retired Air Force Major Donald Kehoe, which lent it unwavering credibility. But press archives show that the main theory was not aliens, but secret Soviet satellites. The fear of Soviet technological superiority made this hypothesis terrifyingly real. However, the identity of the source changes everything. By that time, Donald Kehoe was no longer a military man, but the head of the largest UFO organization, NICAP. This was not a leak, but a planned information campaign. But even if the initial reports were a hoax, what fueled these rumors within the military itself? Engineers in the 1950s were baffled by one question: why were the phantom satellites supposedly in a polar orbit? This is the most complex and energy-intensive trajectory. Its value lies elsewhere. A satellite in a polar orbit scans the Earth like a knife peeling a rotating apple. In just a few orbits, it covers 100% of the surface, which is ideal for espionage. But in the 1950s, neither the US nor the USSR had rockets capable of launching a satellite into such an orbit. This fact should have killed the rumors, but it only strengthened them. This technical impossibility became the entry point for ufologists. Their logic was devastatingly simple. If we didn't do it, and the Russians didn't do it, then they must have. The paradox became the proof. But the rumors and newspaper hoaxes would have remained just that if one researcher hadn't claimed to have deciphered a message from this very satellite. Why did the military personnel who supposedly saw objects on their radars consistently debunk them in the official reports of Project Blue Book? The conspiratorial version claims that Blue Book was a cover-up operation to discredit real sightings. The reality is more mundane. Radar systems of the 1950s were a new, imperfect technology. They often mistook temperature inversions in the atmosphere, meteors, or even flocks of birds for objects. There were phantoms on the radar, but they were not artificial objects. Of the 12,618 cases studied by the project, only 6% remained unidentified. This means that 94 out of 100 sightings had a simple explanation. But no one was interested in mundane explanations, especially when the deciphering of a star map from the gods was at stake. Imagine you are living in 1954. Nuclear tests, secrecy, fear of a surprise attack. You open the newspaper and read about 2 unknown satellites. Officials are silent. You have 2 versions. First, they are secret Soviet spy satellites, and you will never be told the truth. Second, They are alien ships, and you will also never be told the truth. Which version would you be more inclined to believe in that atmosphere of fear and total distrust? Write just one word in the comments, spies or aliens. This will help us all understand how much the context of an era influences perception. Just when the story seemed to have hit a dead end of rumors and anomalies, it took its most audacious leap. In 1973, Scottish writer Duncan Lunan published an article in the April issue of Spaceflight magazine that turned chaos into a message. He claimed to have deciphered the data from those very long-delayed radio echoes of the 1920s. His method was brilliantly simple. He plotted the signal delay times on a graph. The result was like a miracle. The points on the graph formed a precise map of the constellation Bootes, as seen from Earth 13,000 years ago. The map pointed to the sender's home system, Epsilon Bootes. The myth had found an origin story. But just a few years later, Duncan Lunan himself publicly called his methodology unscientific and his conclusions flawed. He had destroyed his own greatest discovery. But it was too late. The myth had its story, and now it only needed one more thing: a face. Who is Duncan Lunan? Not a charlatan, but an erudite science fiction writer and amateur astronomer, genuinely fascinated by the mystery. His original work was full of caveats. If, possibly, probably. He was trying to find order in chaos, just like any researcher. But as soon as his hypothesis hit the press, all those caveats vanished. The media and the UFO community presented his speculation as proven fact. Lunan's idea was like a seed he planted in a pot of qualifications, but the press ripped it out and transplanted it into the wild forest of public imagination, where it grew into an uncontrollable tree of myth. Lunan became world famous for a theory he himself considered a mistake. But even more uncontrollable was the story of an astronaut who had supposedly seen a UFO with his own eyes. How exactly did Lunan see a map? He was working with a graph from Norwegian scientists, which was just a few dozen dots scattered across a field. He made a bold assumption: what if this isn't noise, but a picture? Based on this, he began connecting the dots, rotating and scaling the graph until he got something that resembled a constellation. This is a classic example of apophenia, the psychological tendency to see meaningful patterns in random data. Our brains are wired to find patterns. We see faces in electrical outlets and animals in clouds. Working with just 7 key echo points, Lunan saw a star map in them just as we see shapes in the clouds. It was an act of creation, not decryption. But if this was just a fantasy, then what did the NASA astronauts photograph in 1998? Duncan Lunan's work, though disavowed by him, gave the myth what it desperately needed: a purpose, a history, and an origin. Now the Black Knight was not just a phantom on a radar screen, but an ancient probe with a specific message from a specific civilization. The myth had a narrative. And when a story has a narrative, it needs authority. It needs witnesses who will be believed without question. And who could be a more reliable witness than a man who had been to space? While some were deciphering the past on Earth, others were thought to be encountering the present in orbit. Gordon Cooper, an American hero, one of the original 7 Mercury astronauts, a man with an impeccable reputation. How could it be that he openly claimed to have seen a UFO during his flight? In 1963, during his Mercury 9 mission, he allegedly saw a greenish object approaching his capsule, which was tracked by a monitoring station in Australia. This sounds like the most powerful confirmation. But here's what the documents say. Cooper was indeed convinced of the existence of UFOs. However, he never connected his personal sightings to the Black Knight myth. That connection was made for him by others, arbitrarily linking 2 different narratives. The official transcripts of his 22-orbit flight and subsequent reports contain not a single mention of a UFO. Cooper's testimony is a perfect example of how a myth absorbs any suitable story. But the biggest story was yet to come, when NASA itself provided the evidence. What drove an astronaut, risking his reputation, to speak before the UN for decades, demanding the truth be revealed? He believed the government was not taking the subject of UFOs seriously, and saw it as his mission to make them speak openly. Based on his own experience, he had witnessed flying saucers as an Air Force pilot in Germany in 1951. However, his words were constantly taken out of context. He spoke about his specific sightings, but UFO literature blended everything into a single narrative, attaching his authoritative name to the story of the Black Knight, which he had likely never even heard of. As with Tesla, the myth simply consumed his authority. It acts like a river eroding its bank. It doesn't create new facts, but simply takes particles of authority from such figures to strengthen its own course. The myth needed a hero, and it got one. Now it needed a photograph. If Cooper wasn't alone, which other astronauts saw the Black Knight? If there's a 13,000-year-old artifact in orbit, dozens of people should have seen it. Edgar Mitchell, Deke Slayton. Their quotes about believing in extraterrestrial life are often cited as proof, but none of these astronauts ever specifically mentioned the Black Knight in their memoirs or official reports. Their general musings on UFOs were later artificially attached to this specific myth. To date, more than 600 people from dozens of countries have been to space. If a huge artifact were truly in orbit, it would have been seen by thousands of astronauts and millions of amateur astronomers. Its silence is the loudest refutation. And then, in 1998, what everyone had been waiting for finally appeared. A photograph. And it changed everything. So the astronaut testimonies turned out to be another brick, torn from a completely different context and inserted into the wall of the myth. The legend grew stronger, gaining the voices of respected heroes, but it did not become any truer. Everything we've discussed so far, signals, rumors, decryptions, misinterpreted words, was circumstantial evidence. But all of it pales in comparison to what happened during the Space Shuttle Endeavour mission STS-88. They didn't just hear it, they didn't just believe in it, they photographed it. How did a single photograph, taken in December 1998, manage to unite century-old rumors, newspaper hoaxes, and bold theories into a single, unbreakable legend? It became the visual anchor everyone had been waiting for. Against the backdrop of the first mission to assemble the ISS, a symbol of technological triumph, it appeared. The image instantly went viral, as there were already over 2 million websites online by then. But here is what NASA's archives conceal. This photo, which seems to be the strongest proof, is in fact the weakest and most easily refutable link. It gave a face to a nameless fear. And NASA's official response, which should have put the matter to rest, instead turned the myth into a conspiracy theory. A detail defies common sense. The object's shape in the photo is complex, asymmetrical, and unlike any known satellite. Its charcoal black color absorbs light, and its structure resembles not an engineered product, but a solidified piece of volcanic rock. Myth supporters rejoiced. This is exactly what we expected to see. The reality was a harsh blow. NASA's official explanation was Predelno-specific. It was a thermal protection blanket, lost by astronauts Jerry Ross and James Newman during a spacewalk. Just space debris. And at that moment, the myth morphed into a conspiracy. The reaction was immediate. They are lying to hide the truth. It's too complex a shape for a blanket. But NASA didn't stop at words. Their archives also contained other images of the object, taken within the same minutes. What if the key evidence all this time was not in the most famous picture, but in those taken before and after it? At first glance, the other frames only confirm the object's reality. There it is, from different angles. It's not a film artifact. But the picture changes when we look at the images not as separate pieces of evidence, but as a storyboard of a single motion. Just 4 consecutive frames were enough for the debunking. They show the object tumbling through space, its shape changing radically. It's like watching a silk scarf tossed in the air, not a flying rock. This behavior is impossible for a solid craft, but perfectly describes a light, crumpled blanket. The final blow, here is a photograph of that very thermal blanket before it was lost. The resemblance becomes visually obvious. The icon of the myth is shattered. And so, the main and only visual evidence, the icon of the Black Knight myth, turned out to be common space debris. This discovery seems like the end of the story, but it's not. Debunking the STS-88 photo is not the destruction of the myth, but the acquisition of the final tool for its complete analysis. We now have everything: anomalous signals, Cold War media panic, a sci-fi fantasy, and a hollow visual anchor. We've taken all the parts apart, and they seem harmless. Now that all the evidence is collected, we can move from the question, what is it, to how does it work? It's time to perform a full anatomy of the birth of a ghost. How did an electrical hum in Tesla's lab in 1899 and a lost blanket in 1998 become chapters of the same story? There is a century-long gap and a complete lack of any real connection between them. The secret to this union lies in a 3-step assembly. The first step: gluing anomalies together. Tesla's mysterious signals and the long-delayed radio echo phenomenon from the 1920s, 2 completely different events, were united under the common label, a voice from space. This process is like a magnet brought to sand, pulling out scattered iron filings. The filings themselves are unconnected, but an external force unites them into a pattern. But a voice needed a body, and the mythmakers resorted to appropriation. The 1954 newspaper sensations about Soviet phantoms were stolen and retroactively rewritten as the first sightings of the Black Knight. And the third, decisive step, in 1973, Duncan Lunan gave the nameless anomalies a name, a purpose, and a story about a 13,000-year-old probe from Epsilon Boötis. The skeleton of the story was assembled. But it lacked what makes any myth truly viral. Why did the Black Knight myth remain the domain of a small circle of ufologists for decades, and what force in the late 90s instantly turned it into a global phenomenon? Before 1998, it was a niche story, a tale without a picture. But with the advent of the internet, the speed of information dissemination increased millions of times over. In '98, the internet was a wild west with no fact-checking, full of conspiracy forums. The STS-88 photograph fell on the most fertile ground. It became a visual anchor. It didn't prove the myth, it branded it. Now, a complex story had a simple and powerful symbol that acted like a flash of lightning in the night. It didn't create the landscape of rumors, but it instantly illuminated it, giving clear shape to the chaos. Thus, humanity got a photo of a satellite from before the satellite era. Not because it existed, but because at the right moment, the technology to create global myths emerged. What makes a scientist renounce his most sensational discovery, one that brought him worldwide fame? The story of Duncan Lunan is a story of scientific integrity. His 1973 article was a sensation. His method of deciphering radio echoes as a star map seemed like a breakthrough. But while his followers were expanding on his theory, Lunan himself was re-evaluating his work. By 1976, he had publicly admitted his methodology was unscientific, and his conclusions were flawed. He honestly stated that the data could be interpreted in any way, and that his map was a product of imagination. But the author's retraction did not kill the theory. In conspiratorial circles, it was explained away as pressure from authorities, and the myth grew stronger than its creator. Thus, the 13,000-year-old probe turned out not to be a message from aliens, but a psychological Rorschach test superimposed on random noise. Here they are. The parts of the ghost. A photo of Tesla, newspaper clippings, Lunan's diagram, a snapshot of a blanket. Separately, they are just historical curiosities. But now we see the entire chain. The photograph of the blanket in '98 gave a face to Lunan's theory from '73. His theory, in turn, gave a story to the newspaper hoaxes of '54, and those gave a body to Tesla's anomalous radio signals. The Black Knight turned out to be like a scarecrow. Its head is an old newspaper, its arms are radio signals, its heart is a fantasy. Individually, it's junk. But in the twilight, from a distance, the silhouette is frighteningly human. The Black Knight is not an alien artifact. It is an artifact of the human mind. But debunking the trick is only half the battle. It's far more important to understand why we so desperately want to be deceived. In 2 minutes, we will move from facts to psychology and understand why this legend says more about us than it does about space. In his laboratory in Colorado Springs, at an altitude of 6,500 feet, Tesla was alone with the hum of his coils, the smell of ozone, and the silence of space. His signals, like the radio echoes of the 1920s, were a scientific anomaly for which science had no immediate answer. This created a vacuum of understanding. And the psyche abhors a vacuum of understanding just as nature abhors a vacuum. Any gap in knowledge is immediately filled with the available air, rumors, speculations, and myths. The Black Knight myth is not a lie, but an instinctive attempt to fill this vacuum. It offers a simpler and more exciting answer. It's an ancient observer than the complex scientific reality. It's a not yet fully understood plasma phenomenon. In the fearful atmosphere of the Cold War, this need for certainty was even greater. The story of the satellite became a way to order the chaos by transferring the threat from Earth to space. But bare anomalies do not create a myth. They need a compelling story. For the brain, raw data is cold, uncooked food. Duncan Lunan's story is the same food, but cooked and seasoned. He didn't just propose a hypothesis. He created an epic narrative, an ancient civilization, a star map, a message across millennia. This story speaks to our sense of loneliness in the universe. But even the best story needs an authoritative narrator. The real UFO sightings of astronaut Gordon Cooper, which had no connection to the Black Knight, were appropriated by the myth. His name gave the legend weight. A single testimony from a respected astronaut in a newspaper headline outweighs 10 scientific reports buried in archives. The story and the authority created belief. But what makes us cling to it even in the face of irrefutable evidence? The answer lies in the paradox of the STS-88 photograph. The more evidence NASA provided, the stronger the belief in a conspiracy became. This is confirmation bias. Once we accept a story, we subconsciously look for things that confirm it and ignore things that refute it. And armed with a belief, the brain works not like a microscope, but like a key. It doesn't examine the lock, the fact, but only checks if it fits. If not, the lock is to blame. NASA's explanation is perceived not as a fact, but as an attempt to hide the truth. The Black Knight shows how we have moved from an age of facts to an age of narratives. Its legend lives on not in spite of the evidence, but because of it, turning every refutation into another twist in the conspiracy. We have journeyed from belief to knowledge. Now it's time to make a final choice. This entire investigation was not about a satellite, it was about us. The Black Knight is a mirror, reflecting our greatest hopes that we are not alone, and our deepest fears that we are being lied to. The story confronts us with a choice between two great forces that drive humanity. On one side, imagination. Tesla dreaming of contact, Lunan drawing star charts. On the other, science. Lunan himself refuting his work, NASA engineers analyzing space debris. Imagination is the sail that catches the cosmic wind and carries us toward the unknown. Science is the anchor that keeps the ship from crashing on the rocks of illusion. We need both, but at some point we have to choose. What, in your opinion, is more important for our species? Boundless imagination, capable of creating such worlds, or rigorous science, which brings us back to reality? Write just one word in the comments, imagination or science. Let's see which one we have more of.